Earthquakes, man. They cause everything, everywhere, for like hundreds of miles in every direction to start shaking. Now, sometimes the shaking lasts only a few seconds and, causes your pencil to roll off the edge of your desk. Other times, the shaking lasts several minutes and can be so aggressive that bridges collapse, buildings implode, and populous cities full of thriving residents are instantly transformed into miles of only rubble, death, and homelessness. Now, yes, we've all heard of earthquakes before, but however catastrophic or fearsome or simply unbelievable you thought they were before, I can nearly guarantee you that you will finish this video in even greater awe than before you started, okay? So let's get into it. Well, hello there. Glad to have you back. Welcome to today's episode of Weird Wild World. Of all the violent and dramatic ways nature can fight back against our occupation of this planet, it's hard to imagine one any more insane than earthquakes. Today, we'll learn about why earthquakes happen. We'll take a close look at some of the worst earthquakes in history, when and where they might strike again, and what we can expect the damage to be like in a world growing ever more populated and more full of infrastructure, aka earthquake food. So, you ready to learn some awesome earthquake facts? Nice. Well, open up that brain skull and let's go. Now, the basic concept is easy to understand, right? Ground goes shaky, shaky, stuff falls down, but the underlying causes of earthquakes can be less obvious to the average person. I mean, what is actually happening? What makes the ground suddenly decide to move? And for such a relatively short period of time, right? Well, the answer lies, quite literally, in something known as the lithosphere. A more commonly used term for this is the Earth's crust. Crust. I actually find a helpful way of thinking about it is to imagine that the lithosphere is like the Earth's skin. It's what comprises the top layer of the planet's surface, regardless of what may or may not grow or get put on top of it. Now, the lithosphere on our planet just so happens to be rocky and brittle, as well as divided into 7 humongous and supremely dangerous plates that are constantly shifting and grinding up against each other. Plate tectonics, the theory which first described this phenomenon back in the 1960s, says these shifts are natural and, as far as the plates are concerned, extremely subtle, averaging only a few inches per year. Hey, that doesn't sound so bad. However, for the 7.8 billion humans trapped on top of these plates, this is constant peril. That's because although the normal movement of the plates is relatively constant and totally undetectable to us, fairly often plates get stuck against each other and start to build up friction. Go ahead, drag the palm of your hand along a window, and you'll notice that with the right amount of pressure and the right angle, your hand starts to get stuck. You'll also notice that if you keep applying pressure, eventually your hand will jerk loose and continue sliding across the glass. Now, imagine your hand is the size of Africa and like 120 kilometers thick. That's precisely the same thing that happens from time to time with tectonic plates. And the result is, you guessed it, an earthquake. Instead of gradually and gently drifting a couple inches a year, the plates press against each other for a while and then suddenly shift several feet in a matter of seconds. What this creates are huge waves of energy, which spread out across the Earth's surface. As I mentioned earlier, though, this is business as usual for the planet itself. No big deal, just stretching, really. It just so happens to be an unintended disaster for land-dwelling creatures such as ourselves. But the key thing to understand is that this is just something the planet does. And it's been doing it a lot longer than we've been around. And in case you're wondering, yes, scientists at NASA do think there could be earthquakes on other planets too. For example, Mercury. Though how long before someone's dad chimes in to point out those should be called Mercury quakes instead, we'll never know. Mercury is actually the first planet besides Earth on which scientists have found evidence for quakes, and that evidence is a collection of photos that were taken by NASA's Messenger probe showing fault lines on the planet's surface. The photos were taken between 2011 and 2015, so relatively recently, actually. It's safe to say, though, that the majority of what we know about earthquakes, we know as it pertains to our home planet. And it seems we do actually know quite a lot, even though, like I said, the concept of plate tectonics is only about 60 years old. But in that short time, we've been able to identify not only the 7 major or continental plates, but various subsets of smaller plates contained within each larger plate. There are roughly 6 or 7 medium-sized regional plates for every continental plate, along with several small regional plates. Of course, small still means at least 250,000 square miles or so. Massively enormous, beyond easy visualization for us tiny humans, but it's all relative. I mean, think about the Earth compared to the galaxy. It's pretty small. Now, we've also, perhaps not surprisingly, paid special attention to the locations where these different plates rub their edges together. And in doing so, we've identified a number of different ways they rub together. Whether new crust is created or existing crust is destroyed, or neither. Of course, it goes much deeper than that, no pun intended. But I'm not a geologist. I'm just relaying this information to you from sources like the United States Geological Survey, a government agency and leader in the field. And if you're interested in learning more about our general understanding of plate tectonics, I suggest you check out their website. But for now, the important point is that because of government agencies like this, we now know, for instance, that the reason there are so many earthquakes in California and virtually zero in the Midwest is because California has over 200 fault lines that geologists deem potentially hazardous. Faults, as you may have guessed, are areas where tectonic plates meet and grind against each other. One particular fault in California, called the San Andreas Fault, is famous enough to have had a movie starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson made about it. And the reason is because it is responsible for 2 huge earthquakes that happened in California during the 20th century. So, the San Andreas Fault. This is the meeting point between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, 2 continental plates. These things are as big as they come. And don't forget, the planet doesn't particularly care if the plates meet underwater or on land, or what kind of civilization we happen to build on top of that land. The San Andreas Fault Line runs unapologetically right down the state of California, from way up north, straight through the middle of San Francisco, and all the way down past Los Angeles and San Diego. And if you live in, say, Daly City, just south of San Francisco, you might have a next-door neighbor living on a different continental plate than you, or maybe even a roommate. Although we didn't know it when we first started building these cities, this is quite frankly a really terrible place for them to be. Millions and millions of people living in a danger zone of this teetering natural force. And experts calculate there is a 99% chance that another major earthquake will strike here again within the next 30 years. And yes, we're here to talk about massive earthquakes today, but it's still interesting and kind of illuminating to know that earthquakes are mostly very small and out in the middle of the ocean somewhere, and they happen virtually all the time. IRIS, a research consortium in Washington, D.C., estimates there are as many as 200 earthquakes a day worldwide. So, we live helplessly on top of giant shifting plates whose edges rip right through some of our most populous cities. And although we do know roughly where these plates are and can calculate probabilities, we can barely predict, let alone prevent, earthquakes. And there are hundreds of them happening all over the world every single day. You terrified yet? Well, you're not alone. Earthquakes have been terrorizing humanity for as long as humanity has been around. And however frightening it is to view the situation with our current scientific understanding, it must have been immeasurably more frightening for people prior to the advent of plate tectonics and modern science. So it's not hard to see why people in the past would simply assume earthquakes and other natural disasters were caused not by shifting plates, but angry deities. In his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker explains how, as far as ancient people knew, the forces of nature had to have been under the control of powerful beings living above and beyond humankind. No other explanation made any sense at the time. It was also clear to many different ancient peoples across cultures and continents and centuries that These nature-controlling deities were exceedingly ill-tempered, Floods, fires, plagues, storms, landslides, droughts, and of course earthquakes were clearly all swift and harsh punishments for some kind of human misbehavior. Or perhaps certain deities just had a ravenous appetite for human death. Pinker actually speculates, I think convincingly, that the baffling horror of human sacrifice was really just an attempt to preemptively satisfy the godly appetite for death, and hopefully minimize the damage in the long run. Clearly, and thankfully, interpretations of natural disasters and their underlying causes have developed since then. But truth be told, it wasn't really until the 20th century that we began to properly understand what actually causes earthquakes. For centuries before then, we still interpreted earthquakes as some kind of divine punishment, even if we no longer beheaded children to try to prevent them. But disappointingly, if not downright depressingly, not everyone is on board with our modern understanding, even today. For example, in 2016, a Vatican priest named Giovanni Cavalcoli claimed that earthquakes are actually divine punishment for gay civil unions. It's worth mentioning that he made the claim in response to Italy finally legalizing civil unions for gay couples. Not marriage, mind you, civil unions. Fun fact, gay marriage still illegal in Italy, thanks in part to the perverted efforts of authority figures like Giovanni Cavalcoli. Earthquakes play a big role in human civilization and human culture. We've only recently begun to get the faintest idea of what's really going on, but we've had a treacherous relationship with the extraordinary phenomenon for pretty much as long as we've been able to record history. And of course, probably before that too. And as you're about to see as we move to actually looking at some specific examples, interpretations of earthquakes, their effects on society, and the overall impact they have can all vary surprisingly dramatically. All right, now that we know what earthquakes are and how we humans tend to feel about them, let's dive into some of the most massive earthquakes this planet has ever seen. Most people who know a thing or two about earthquakes would probably assume that they're measured by something called the Richter scale. And that used to be true. The way the original Richter scale worked was by simply measuring the size of the waves created by the earthquake. And it seems sensible enough, but today, the preferred way to measure earthquakes is actually by using the moment magnitude scale. This basically measures how much energy is released by the fault itself when the edges slip off each other, and supposedly the measurements are much more precise. Similar to its predecessor, the moment magnitude scale deems any earthquake that registers as 8 or higher to be among the rare group of earthquakes that can level cities, and usually only happen once or twice a decade, and we'll be looking at some of those. The moment magnitude scale, by the way, didn't come around until the 1970s, but seismologists are still able to make educated guesses about infamous earthquakes that came many years earlier. Of course, they weren't there to measure these historical earthquakes in real time, so presumably they're basing their estimates on the damage that we know was caused. For example, as far back as the year 365 AD, seismologists have made an estimate as to the size of the earthquake that once rocked the Greek islands. And when I say rocked, it's a profound understatement. This earthquake completely upended Mediterranean society, in particular the island of Crete at its epicenter. A historian at the time named Ammianus Marcellinus was pretty clear in his description of the event, calling it, quote, the destruction of all the world. Subtle. Other descriptions from people present have been a little more helpful for scientists looking to diagnose what actually happened. For example, a Greek scholar named Libanius recorded that he witnessed the earthquake, quote, originating from beneath the seas and causing huge and devastating waves that swept over the island. That was fairly observant for a guy caught up in the middle of the apparent destruction of all the world. Now, though he couldn't have known it at the time, Libanius was probably watching a massive fault in the Mediterranean Sea near the Hellenic Trench suddenly have a major slip. And when faults slip underwater, it's especially bad news because those energy waves I mentioned earlier get transferred to the water as well as the ground. A big enough quake will cause nightmarishly huge waves to come crashing to shore in the form of tsunamis. This is perhaps just nature's way of washing away all the rubble and drowning all the newly homeless people it just created. Who knows? As we'll see though, this wasn't the only time in history that an earthquake and tsunami struck in tandem, but it is one of the earliest well-documented cases, and the destruction was immense. Ocean waves poured through major cities as far apart as Spain and Egypt, killing tens of thousands of people and destroying homes and crops. Most amazing of all, the island of Crete itself was geologically transformed overnight, rising more than 30 feet out of the water. Just imagine that. A little while later, that historian Ammianus Marcellinus apparently collected himself and wrote a history of Rome, which he fittingly titled Roman History. His new description of the events were a little more lucid, but still remarkably dramatic. Quote, "The solidity of the earth was made to shake, and the sea was driven away. The waters returning when least expected killed many thousands by drowning. Huge ships perched on the roofs of houses hurled miles from the shore." Wow. Waves hitting shores more than 2,000 miles apart, an island rising more than 30 feet in the air, huge ships perched on the roofs of houses, and many thousands killed. Seismologists think this mind-bending chaos was all brought on by one of the biggest earthquakes in history, probably ranking somewhere between 8 and 8.5 on the moment magnitude scale. Yet, as crazy as it is to think about this level of destruction coming so suddenly to civilization so many years ago, it's even crazier to look at more recent examples of the same natural phenomenon wreaking similar havoc on more recent societies. If you think the earthquake in Crete in 365 caused a disaster of biblical proportions, tell that to the people of Portugal in 1755. Portugal is a very biblical society. A poll in 2011 showed that roughly 85% of the population is Christian. And back in 1755, that number would almost certainly have been higher. And this ended up playing an important role not only in earthquake history, but religious history as well. On November 1st, 1755, a monster earthquake erupted in the nation's capital city of Lisbon. The same thoughtful God who built tectonic plates in the first place had also been anything but subtle with the timing of this particular quake. November 1st is All Saints' Day. Churches all around the country, but especially in Lisbon, were packed full with worshipers. In the 18th century, many of the buildings, including the churches, were made of stone and collapsed under the onslaught of violent shaking. Some 12,000 buildings were destroyed in Lisbon, virtually all of them likely inhabited by people at the time. Just imagine that. 12,000 buildings all destroyed in minutes, without warning. And those who managed to escape whatever building they were in understandably tried to get as far away from any building as possible, so they fled to the coastline. And this may have been their only option, but it was anything but safe. Tsunami waves ranging from 20 to 65 feet high met them there, crushing and drowning many more helpless churchgoers. The next time you're standing near a 6-story building, imagine that building is actually a wall of ocean water about to fall on top of your head. Yeah. In 1755, roughly 250,000 people lived in Lisbon. This one event killed 70,000 of them, more than a quarter of the entire population. This Thanos-like purge played out brutally and mercilessly, and it must have seemed like it was specifically targeted against practicing Christians. I mean, after all, why unleash such murderous forces of nature precisely when so many faithful were gathered indoors in church in a vulnerable position? Just like many people centuries before them, the people of Portugal couldn't help but assume God was really freaking angry with them. In the long run, though, the disastrous Lisbon earthquake of 1755 spawned a large body of literature that challenged contemporary religious beliefs and advanced more scientific explanations for things like deadly earthquakes. At a time when printed media was expanding, news of the disaster also spread quite far, including a relatively deep library of illustrations produced by various artists. And the story of this terrible disaster spread all over Europe right in the middle of the Age of Enlightenment, when tensions between religious orthodoxy and contemporary philosophy were already very high. Great thinkers like John Locke had already been advancing new concepts like the separation of church and state. So this seemingly ungodly act of violence against innocent churchgoers in Lisbon played a large role in pushing people further in the direction they were already heading, namely towards scientific rationalism and away from belief in the church or even God in general. An earthquake powerful enough to kill 70,000 people and leave the rest literally questioning God's existence seems like it would have been the absolute pinnacle of worst-case scenarios. And although recent in terms of human history overall, 1755 was well over like 250 years ago. It feels almost fictional, like another world where mythological events like the Lisbon earthquake can actually happen, but not now, right? Well, the shocking truth is there have been earthquakes both significantly larger and more deadly than in Lisbon, and much more recently too. One example was in 2004, when a massive fault off the western coast of Indonesia created one of the deadliest disasters in human history. This evil fault line constitutes the meeting place between the India Plate and the Burma Plate. And what makes this fault so dangerous, aside from the fact that the India Plate is significantly bigger than India itself, is that it's a subduction zone. And subduction zones are responsible for the most hypermassive earthquakes. They are created when, rather than simply grinding together all sexy-like, one plate actually wedges itself underneath another plate. And when you imagine this happening with plates the size of continents that billions of people live on top of, you can see how it might be problematic. And it was definitely problematic in 2004. The India Plate shoved itself underneath the Burma Plate on December 26 and created one of the biggest earthquakes in recorded history. Seismologists calculated a 9.1 score on the moment magnitude scale. And this is a good time to note that the moment magnitude scale is logarithmic, similar to like decibels when measuring the volume of a sound. And it's a base 10 logarithmic scale, which means one number higher on the scale means 10 times stronger in real life. Yeah, that really means that if, let's say, the earthquake that parked ships on the tops of buildings and brought about the end of the world back in Crete was, say, an 8.1, which is within seismologists' current estimates, then the earthquake off the coast of Indonesia in 2004 was roughly 10 times as powerful. Now, if you're wondering why this didn't just straight up destroy all of civilization, well, for an astonishing number of people, it did. Though many miles from the shore of Sumatra, Indonesia's largest and westernmost island, the underwater quake generated ocean waves that were 100 feet tall. And in rapid succession, these apocalyptic great walls of water crashed into the coast, not only of Sumatra, but Thailand, India, Sri Lanka, and even South Africa. As can be witnessed firsthand in a large collection of video footage, civilization definitely was destroyed for people living on Sumatra's northwest coast, and death and destruction were suddenly introduced to an enormous portion of the world's people. Just 8 hours after the earthquake first erupted, nearly 230,000 people had been killed, making it one of the deadliest earthquakes in history. Of course, human life is the most important measure, so it would be easy to argue that 2004 saw the worst earthquake ever. However, as hard as it is to wrap your head around, it may not have been. There are a few other earthquakes in history that may or may not have killed even more people. The most notable of these happened in Haiti in 2010. It's possible that significantly more people were killed beneath Haiti's vulnerable infrastructure than were killed in Indonesia in 2004, with the highest estimates at 300,000 dead. Amazingly, though, other estimates are as low as 160,000. I mean, not low at all, really, but it is a huge discrepancy in the estimation, which is crazy to think that even in 2010, such a massive disaster could strike and we really wouldn't know for sure how many people were killed, like not even get close. What we do know for sure, though, is that 2004 did not see the most powerful earthquake ever, nor did it see the most destructive in terms of financial costs. The latter title belongs to an earthquake that struck Japan even more recently than either Sumatra or Haiti. In 2011, an earthquake the same size as the one in Sumatra 7 years earlier struck off the coast of Honshu, Japan. And you guessed it, this was once again the work of a subduction zone, this time in the Pacific Ocean. And researchers recently discovered that the fault may have released virtually all of its stress at once, which had built up over centuries. And the result was a tsunami. Though deceptive to the naked eye, a powerful current of ocean water began steadily pouring into Japanese harbors and eventually into coastal Japanese cities, as an archive of unforgettable footage shows. And tragically, this killed close to 16,000 people and possibly a few thousand more. Where the event really tapped the record books, though, was in property damage. More than 200 square miles in Japan were flooded. The BBC reported that entire towns in Japan were simply erased from existence by ocean water. They also, like every other news outlet on Earth at the time, reported what is likely the most infamous part of the entire story, the nuclear disaster. Not only did Japan experience one of the largest earthquakes in recorded history, and not only did many thousands die in a map redesigning ocean invasion, but they also had to deal with a nuclear disaster, comparable to the Chernobyl incident. Like basically everywhere and everything else in the area, nuclear reactors at the Fukushima plant and Okuma filled up with ocean water. And although it might seem slightly counterintuitive, this actually caused 3 reactors to overheat and experience meltdown. This is reportedly because the water broke the cooling systems that were needed to help keep the reactors operating safely. Somehow, though, nobody was killed as a direct result of the meltdowns. Of course, many employees of the plant were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Surprisingly, though, the World Health Organization released a report in 2013 saying they expect no observable increase in cancer rates in the region, which is astonishingly lucky. However, lucky doesn't seem like a fitting word to describe that day in Japan overall, though improbable surely does. Even in Tokyo, relatively far south of the epicenter, the entire city basically shut down, and its 37 million residents feared for their lives. As one eyewitness reports, "I saw high-rises sway like I had never seen before. All the trains were suspended, but some subways resumed service, and now I'm on one of them trying to get home. People are sleeping at stations. They have tarps prepared, but it's extremely cold, even in Tokyo." Man, the spontaneous shutting down of one of the largest and busiest cities in the world sounds like an absolute nightmare. All in all, as I mentioned earlier, this went down as the most expensive natural disaster in history, period. The World Bank estimated $235 billion in damages, while the Japanese government estimated over $300 billion. Okay, so we've covered the costliest earthquakes in terms of both human lives and infrastructural damage, but we still haven't covered the single most powerful earthquake of all time. Both of those 9.1 quakes in Sumatra and Japan pale in comparison to the all-time record holder off the coast of Chile. The Valdivia earthquake of 1960 killed or injured several thousand people, cost millions of dollars in damage, and most notably, left 2 million people without homes. You probably wouldn't guess it when comparing the toll to the other famous earthquakes we discussed, but this one was the biggest, 9.5 on the moment magnitude scale. Keeping in mind the counterintuitive logarithmic nature of the scale, that means it was roughly 10 times as powerful as the quake that leveled Lisbon back in 1755. As far as we know, no other quake has ever been as powerful as that. But one certainly could be. We haven't even gotten to the most terrifying part of the entire story, and that is the future. See, one thing you may have noticed about most of these massive earthquakes throughout history is they all started out in the ocean. While the shaking often does incredible damage, much, if not most of the damage, is the deaths that result from the crazy waves that come crashing from the ocean into coastal cities. Consider this. Banda Aceh, the city in Sumatra worst affected by the tsunami, is 150 miles away from the actual fault line. The fault line itself had a 900-mile-long rupture, which produced waves as high as 100 feet, moving at 500 miles an hour, which eventually killed all those people. But I'll repeat that. 900-mile rupture. 100-foot waves, 500 miles an hour. And that's only what people 150 miles away had to deal with. Imagine a civilization built literally on top of the fault line. Well, you shouldn't have to try very hard to imagine because one already exists, and I mentioned it earlier in this video. It's a place called California. Ever heard of it? See, unlike the other huge faults mentioned in this story, the San Andreas Fault actually wanders its way out of the ocean and right through a huge stretch of one of the most populous and infrastructurally developed places on Earth. As I mentioned, 2 large earthquakes have already caused damage to California cities in the last century. Now, neither one was massive enough to warrant diving into here, but it seems patently obvious that all the ingredients are in place for that to change in the future. Possibly soon, possibly in a big way. Another very large portion of land I haven't mentioned yet is Alaska. The population is only roughly 1 person per square mile. Compare that to New York City is 27,000. It's also not super built up like much of California, but Alaska is something of a mecca for earthquakes. According to the University of Alaska Fairbanks, well over 15,000 earthquakes have occurred in the state so far in just 2021 alone. Alaska is also the site of the runner-up for largest earthquake in history, and the largest in U.S. history. The rupture occurred between the same two plates that make up the San Andreas Fault, namely the Pacific and North American plates. The 1964 earthquake came in at a reading of 9.2 on the moment magnitude scale, even larger than either Sumatra or Japan. And like those two later earthquakes, massive tsunamis were also generated, but only 131 people were killed this time. We can thank Alaska's low population and sparse infrastructure for this relatively merciful death count. But of course, it's still a horrendous tragedy. And what happens as the world's population continues to increase and infrastructure continues to expand virtually everywhere? Well, ask the university in Fairbanks. The earthquakes aren't stopping up there anytime soon. The same goes for an astonishing portion of the world we live in altogether. Take a look at the map of the so-called Ring of Fire. The Ring of Fire is what geologists call the fault lines surrounding the Pacific tectonic plate. It is thousands and thousands of miles long and appears almost deliberately aimed at human civilization from virtually every angle. From the deep south of Chile on South America's coast, all the way up through California and Alaska, under the Bering Strait and down past Japan, most of Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. At any moment, pretty much any portion of this aptly named Ring of Fire could rupture and cause another earthquake-tsunami hybrid. And honestly, I don't know that there's much more we can do other than accept that possibility and just do our best to prepare for when it happens. Some of this is already underway, of course. For instance, after the disastrous flooding in 2011, Japan has taken to building much higher walls along the coastline to keep out the water next time. Some of these are as high as 45 feet. And in San Francisco, there's a building code called the Tall Building Safety Strategy. The name is self-explanatory, but the way it actually works is fascinating. Everything from the materials used to the size and shape of the building is regulated based on essentially one objective: flexibility. The more rigid a building is, the more vulnerable it is to collapse during an earthquake. One famous example of a flexible San Francisco building is perhaps also the city's most recognizable, the Trans-America Pyramid. The shape of the building itself, as well as the huge concrete truss at the base, are just two prominent examples of numerous design choices that were made specifically with earthquakes in mind. The building was actually controversial when it was first completed in 1972. Many residents felt it was ugly. But in context, I have to say the objection sounds pretty silly. The Trans-America Pyramid survived a 6.9 earthquake in 1989, but the question is, would it survive a 9.5 earthquake, like the one that happened in Chile in 1960? Well, the scary truth is we very well may get to find out. The ingredients are all there, and seismologists say that on average, an earthquake above 8 on the moment magnitude scale happens roughly once a year. So it's very, very likely we will see more catastrophes like the ones described in this video. The real questions are, where will they strike next, and how prepared will we be? Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, go ahead and comment and like and subscribe and all that good stuff. Check out my channel, A Voyage of Being, for content about stuff I'm interested in, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.